I grew up in Oslo, Norway. Both my parents were teenagers during World War II. And so there was something that really impacted them. That was always a bit of a shadow over my life as I was a child. And when I was asked to do a presentation for our local chapter last year or earlier this year, I thought, this is a topic that's interesting because it covers so many areas. So like I told you earlier, I'm kind of a mile wide and an inch deep, and this presentation is testament to that. So we're not going to talk about all the different sensor markings the Germans used in Oslo in December 1943. That's a different presentation. We're gonna do a broad sweep, tell a lot of stories. I will intermingle some personal stories just because many of you have heard the official stories. And if you have questions, don't save them, just ask. So with that, any questions before we start? Can you see okay? A little hard to see from the back. I can always zoom in if need be. So this is a brief history of mail delivery and communication during the years where Nazi Germany occupied Norway. It's, like I said, a big topic. It's mile wide and an inch deep. And my primary focus would be on, mail delivery, communication routes, and the role played by the resistance. Again, there will be less focus on stamp issues and philatelic topics, and I'll tell you some personal stories. So again, about 50 minutes. We'll do a Q&A at the end or throughout as works for you guys. So Norway, for most of you, you know this. But I've given this presentation to non-Scandinavian people. So, we're a kingdom in Northern Europe. We've been an independent nation since 1905 when we went out of our union with Sweden. The capital is in Oslo. We have about 5.5 million people as of today. Our monarch is King Harald V. He became king in 1992. Our political leader is Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre, who used to hang out at my house when I was a kid because he went to high school with my sister. So Norway is not that big. Our first stamp issue came out in 1855, Norway #1, there with the Haugesund Cancel, which is the town my dad is from. And that's a little bit about Norway. So prior to World War II, Norway's mail service was overall very efficient. It was shipped by ground, it went by ship, and we were experimenting with airmail. We had in the 1930s numerous boats going directly from Norway overseas to the United States. My grandfather, in fact, owned a ship that went in service between Norway and the Faroe Islands, routes to the UK and to Europe. And so it was very open communication. We had just started experimenting with airmail right before the war started. Here's one of my favorite covers that I got a few years ago from a Norwegian collector of airmail. This was at an auction. And this was interesting to me because it was sent from Denver, which is where I live, roughly, to Norway, which is where I'm from. But also the modes of transportation of being sent by train to the East Coast, then by boat, SS Bremen, across the Atlantic, and then with catapult plane, just to speed up the delivery by maybe a day or two, once they get closer to the shore. We launched this catapult plane, and then again by train from Bremen to Norway through Sweden. And so this to me is just a beautiful cover that I'm fond of and like, and again showing we had started using airmail, to send overseas. This is a picture of Bremen, actually, and a picture of the catapult plane, how it was catapulted off the ship. Another cover, this sent by Hindenburg from to Moss in Norway, which is on the east side of the Oslo Fjord. I find it interesting. There's 2 Swedish stamps there that serves absolutely no purpose. No idea how they ended up there, but they're on the cover. Again, went by air on the Hindenburg. This was the 9th flying, or the eighth fly of the Hindenburg, and we all know what happened with the last one.
Question. What are those Swedish stamps going on there?
I have no idea. They serve no purpose because it was franked correctly already. So there's no knowledge of why they ended up there. But it went through Sweden, and maybe somebody thought there wasn't sufficient postage to go to Norway, and so they popped them on there.
So stamps, is the little Reek spot, is that a stamp? I can't see, or that was a postal safety allocators person?
Yep, they're stamps. All right, so we were advancing technology on all fronts in communication, in technology. This is my grandfather, who's a very modest man. I knew him as a child. And you can see where he's standing. He's standing under a swastika. They're in Germany in 1936. My grandfather was the HR manager for the utility company. And he was in Berlin in 1936 to learn how to use a hollerith machine. Does anybody know what a hollerith machine is? It was a punch card reader. And they were being advanced, and they wanted to introduce a computer in their HR department so they could process payroll faster. This is again 1936. This is what the hollerith machine looked like. And many of you may know what Nazi Germany also used this technology for later on in the war. If you don't know, you can read the book IBM and the Holocaust, which tells that story. But let's just suffice that this technology helped Hitler rounding up Jews much more quickly than he would have otherwise. So it's a kind of a dark side to that story. But again, my grandfather traveled to Berlin. We had, wide open communication, even though by this time the Nazi Party was in command in Germany. It was still very much, the war wasn't quite on the horizon yet. This is the same year that they hosted the Summer Olympics and the Winter Olympics in Germany. So we start developing airmail service in Norway in the late 30s. A route is established in September of 39 from Scotland to Stavanger to Oslo to Stockholm to Helsingfors. And this is back when planes are a little bit like trains. We have stations. It's kind of like if you ever gone from Seattle to Juneau, there's a plane that stops at every little Sitka and all the way up along the coast. That was kind of how a lot of airmail or airlines operated. It wasn't just go from Chicago to Denver. It was go from Scotland to Stavanger to Oslo to Stockholm to Helsingfors. And so in the fall of 39, they started planning a route between Berlin and Stavanger. Now, it's interesting to me that they choose Stavanger over Oslo, because Oslo is the capital, Stavanger is a much smaller town. And they were actually even producing first flight covers for this flight that was going to go from Berlin to Stavanger. This was supposed to launch on January 4th, 1940. But by then, the relations with Germany had gotten so fierce that the Norwegian government decided to not go ahead with that flight. In January of 1940 as well, there was a Norwegian delegation in New York to talk about a new air route between Bergen and New York. So a lot of developments in terms of speeding up, communication was taking place. Then, of course, April 9th, 1940, Hitler attacks Norway. This has been building up for quite some time. They've already occupied Austria, Poland. Norway was more of a strategic acquisition, not so much that they intended to take over Norway, but that it was a strategic position for Germany to attack west. If they could control the whole North Sea, that would help them with the invasion of Great Britain. Now, they were it wasn't quite like taking candy from a in April of 1940. It did not take Germany very long to occupy most of Norway. They did meet some resistance this ship here is called the Blucher, and it was sunk right about here as it was going up the Oslo Fjord. My brother-in-law served with the man that fired the cannon when he was in the military. This man at that point was an old man who didn't hear very well, probably from a lot of cannon fires, but this man had single-handedly sunk one of the big German warships. Nevertheless, and that ship's still on the bottom of the Oslo Fjord. But the Germans succeeded, and in fairly short order, they occupied most of southern Norway by April 9th, 10th. The king and his family and the government escaped north and managed to get on a ship bound for England, and they were brought to safety. Many had thought that the Norwegian king would do what the Danish king did, which was just surrender and agree, but they did not. There's a movie called The King's No, which is how the king of Norway, King Håkon VII, who was the first modern day king of Norway, by the way, resisted the Germans. So what is the impact of occupation on mail delivery? Well, within the first week, mail delivery is completely interrupted in all the occupied areas. Rail service, air service, and ship routes are halted. Many train tracks were blown up. Several post offices, key post offices, were bombed by the Germans. Some were actually damaged by Norwegians as a protection, trying to prevent the Germans from furthering up north into the country. Norway is a very long country, and the further north you get, less population. So the Germans were slower. They wanted to conquer the more populated areas. But within a fairly short amount of time, mail service continues in the occupied areas as well as in the non-occupied areas. Mail ships are sunk. Some bridges and rail tracks are blown up by both sides. And again, several strategic post offices in some fairly large Norwegian cities like Elverum, Namsos, Åndalsnes, and Kristiansund are bombed. And I'll talk specifically about Kristiansund because that's where my family lived on my dad's side, and they were a particularly bad case. Norway had resisted the Germans only so much, but they had still not managed to occupy northern Norway. And northern Norway was a key strategic point for the Germans because there was a lot of iron ore coming out of Sweden. Now, remember, Sweden is neutral, but the Germans are still allowed to go into Sweden and extract iron ore. But in the winter months, you can't get the iron ore out this way because this is frozen. So the only way to get the iron ore out is through Norway. And therefore, it was important for Germany to occupy specifically the town of Narvik. That's another Netflix movie. It's just called Narvik, Narvik. And it's about the history of Narvik defending itself before the Germans eventually take over. But Hitler is getting impatient. He's like, these damn Norwegians, they need to just lay down and surrender. And so he wanted to make an example. And the example was Kristiansund, the town my family is from. They bombed that town completely asunder. I think over 60% of the buildings were leveled in the course of 3 days, April 28th through May 1st, 1940. And these are personal photos that my grandfather took after the bombing was over. Again, they had no strategic reason for bombing Kristiansund. No major industry besides dried cod. That's the main industry in Kristiansund. Bacalao, is that what we call it here? And klippfisk is what we call it in Norwegian. But they just wanted to set an example. This is what will happen to you if you don't surrender. And they use Kristiansund as an example. This is my grandfather, Evan Larsen, who I'm named after. That was his bakery after the bombing. That was pretty much, it's all gone. The baker standing outside. My grandfather, the son of the baker died before the war. He didn't see his bakery bombed. So by June 10th, Narvik falls. So it was basically, April, May, June, 3 months from the invasion when Oslo fell until the last town fell. During this time, Norwegians continue with censorship or post control, as they call it in Norway. So you have certain post offices still operating as free, inspecting all mail from a Norwegian perspective. Meanwhile, you have the German censors in all the occupied areas. But essentially, during World War II, we developed multiple postal systems. So we have the official Norwegian postal service called Norsk Postverk, since changed name. Now we just call it Posten, but that was the name during, the early part of the last century. We have, and it's taken over by Germany. It's run by Norwegians who are members of the Nazi Party. We also have within the Norwegian Postal Service an underground service, employees who are actually working, sabotaging, underneath. Then we have the German military field post, Feldpost, which all the military bases would have, whether they were stationary or ships moving around, they would have their own postmarks, which is a whole nother collection area. Over time, the Germans didn't trust their own military field posts for certain sensitive communications, so they developed the German official mail, Deutsches Dienstpostamt, where you have German stamps mailed from Norway. It's another interesting collection area. And then we had Red Cross mail, which Bob and I talked about last night. I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we also had courier mail going between Norway and Sweden, which was handled by the Resistance Group, which I'll talk about. So, yes.
You mentioned with the Norsk Postverk that they were Norwegians who were members of the Nazi Party. Was that something that happened after the?
Yeah, it was a gradual transition. So after the Nazis, so at first the Germans just took it over, but then they appointed a postmaster general who was Norwegian, but who was a member of the Norwegian Nazi Party.
Did they have that? Was that before?
Yes, and I will get to that. Yep. Great question. So again, we have a transition period in April to June 1940, where we have, most of Norway has fallen, most of southern Norway. We have still Norwegian post control in the non-occupied areas. Those covers are hard to find. I bid on them periodically, and I tend to give up around $500-600 because they're not that, exotic covers, but it's just the postal history and that they're rare. And of course, different labels used in different post offices. So you have German control in occupied areas, and then again, Narvik is the last city to fall, June 10th, 1940. But here is an example of Norwegian post control. So these would be the labels or the markings that you would see on a Norwegian letter. This is one I didn't win, but I just took a picture of it. That says "kontrollert." So you have the Norwegian insignia, and then there's a variety of different, labels. And so some of these are fairly common, and some of them are extremely uncommon. And so that again is a tiny little collection area from April 1940 to June 1940 of Norwegian controlled mail in a German occupied Norway. So I'll talk a little bit about the question this gentleman asked about, the rise and fall of the Norwegian Nazi Party. So the Norwegian Nazi Party under Vidkun Quisling is started the same year as when Hindenburg appoints Hitler as chancellor. So in 1933. And so not really any different than some of the political movements we see today where, certain countries start adopting different political ideologies and other countries follow along. The Nazi movement in the 1920s led to many other countries having Nazi party, including Norway. And by 1941, Svein Svendsen is installed as Norway's postmaster, and he's a member of NS, National Samling. National Samling means national gathering. Let's stand up strong for a new Norway. Vidkun Quisling is elected prime minister in 1942. I didn't realize that. I thought he had been appointed by 1940, but the first few years, the Germans pretty much ran the country. They didn't trust the Norwegians yet. But by 1943, there's 43,000 members of National Samling. So that's a fairly large percentage. If you think about it, at the time, Norway had about a population of 3 million people. I mean, it's still very small, but the fact that there were 43,000 members, you know, after May 8th, 1945, when Norway was liberated, those people either were in extreme cases like Vidkun Quisling, you know, he was executed. Many people went to jail. Some people just left the country, and others were hiding, lying underground. I mean, I knew many friends growing up who said, well, yeah, grandpa was a member of NS during World War II, and so that's something the family's proud of. But the reality is, in spite of what you may have heard, there were a lot of Norwegians who sympathized with Hitler. So this is kind of a view of Europe in 1941, right about the time when the US gets involved and changes the course of World War II. So anything in deep red is occupied. You have Switzerland and Sweden, who are neutral. And you have, you know, Germany making an advance on the Soviet Union, which of course failed. And then you have countries in green like Spain and Turkey who are not involved. Just again, to give a picture of the situation. So again, mail service after the occupation. Domestic mail service resumes within a relatively short amount of time in Oslo. I'm talking about within a week. But most international mail now gets rerouted through Germany. I say most because there were some people on the Swedish border up north who were delivering mail by dog sled, and they hadn't gotten the message. So there was some mail delivery from Norway to Sweden in northern Norway after this that kind of slipped through the cracks. But that's very unusual. So all mail incoming and outgoing is inspected. And again, all international mail goes through German. It not only goes through German censors, but it's sent to Germany before it's distributed out. And any mail that's going to, I lost my zooming ability. Once I start typing on the screen, it won't zoom anymore. But this, it wouldn't make any sense anyway, because it's in Norwegian. But basically, this is the rules for mail abroad. And it basically says that any mail going to a country that we consider the enemy will be destroyed.
So on a document like this, is this Nynorsk or Bokmål?
Bokmål. But I'm sure they had a Nynorsk version of it as well. We have two different dialects, written versions of Norwegian. They're very similar. You know, you could easily understand both. But basically what it says is if you're sending a letter to the US, we will let it go through. If you're sending a letter to an enemy, Great Britain or France, it will not go through. And that was basically the rule. And so, of course, over time, that changed. But, you know, here's a letter sent to Oslo in June of, thought I had it, have some of these. I'll pass some of these around, but, you know, this is a letter sent from Virginia, or sent from Oslo to Virginia, September 15th. So that's pre-involvement. Here's the letter sent from New York City to Oslo, and you can see the censor marks on the back. Geöffnet, opened. Again, different censor marks is a big collection area. Many of you may know more about that than me. So mail was going back and forth between Norway and the US up until Pearl Harbor. Then that stopped as well. Though there were some December. Yeah. Yep. So long story short, you could mail any foreign country as long as they were on the good side of Germany, but you could not mail anybody who were on this list. And on this list, I'll read to you some of the countries because you can't see it, but it says Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, France, Egypt, Sudan, and Iraq. And of course, number one on the list, Great Britain.
So that said, I mean, were they 100% effective in destroying that mail, or did you get through?
I do not know. But I do know, I found out recently, I wrote a story on the flag series from the US. And I found out because the rarest flag series covers you can find are those that made it to Germany. And there were prisoners of war in the US who were allowed to send mail to Germany. And the flag series would generally be destroyed because it was considered propaganda. But a few covers have made it through. So those are quite rare. So I'm sure there were exceptions and things that slipped through.
Question,
Yes,
the flags are to mean the occupied nation?
the Overrun Country series.
Overrun
Yeah.
Country.
In Norway, we call it the flag series because
Because I posted the Norway flag stamp on Facebook on Second of Mai.
yeah,
And I got response from the Norwegians that said that was incorrect, that the white stripe was too narrow.
yeah. Well, they
I'd
used,
like-
that's a very long story. We'll take that another time, but they have 4 different flags in Norway and they did use the correct one. So, you know, maybe, who knows? Anyways, these are just some of the different examples of sensor marks used in Oslo alone. And again, that's a whole collection area that you can see that's, you know, people collect these because some of these are rare and some of these are common. Here is a typical censored letter from, you know, Norway to Sweden. I'll send around a couple of examples here. This one is interesting to me because it contains stamps. This was a stamp business, Østensen. It's a stamp business in Oslo, and they were sending stamps by registered mail to Sweden. Coincidentally, a little bit later, the Oslo Philatelic Society that I belong to was permitted by the Germans to send stamps censor-free. So they would guarantee that if I sent you stamps from Norway to Switzerland, that they were authentic and they wouldn't be opened and accidentally losing some stamps.
That cover, that one. Rolf Gubison was a very famous dealer in Stockholm.
Huh? So he was a dealer as well.
What?
Interesting. Yeah, I have that one in my collection. Somewhere in here. I have a whole album here of covers from World War II that I'm sending around a few as examples. So the other thing going on is that, you know, Norway, while our military was more or less non-existent, our government was in London in exile. We had a lot of people in Norway fighting in sort of a citizen-led resistance movement, including employees of the Postal Service. So people working for the Postal Service would deliberately try to, you know, interfere in any type of German communication as much as they could. But of course, the risk of being caught could lead to capture, torture, possibly death. So you had to be really careful. And the other activity they were involved in was the distribution of, you know, illegal newspapers that promoted the resistance movement, that helped facilitate the resistance movement. So there's sort of the official tier of the Postal Service, and then there's this sort of the secret post office that's working inside there, sort of a covered operation. We have the German Feldpost, and there's an example of that in one of these. Some of those were permanent, others were semi-permanent, like ships or battalions on the move. And so this area is a big collection area. This number right here identifies a specific battalion or a ship. And we actually have a book in the SEC library that identifies all those numbers. So if you have one of these German Feldpost, you can find out which battalion or which ship that was. Most of these are stampless covers. Then we have the German official mail. So the German officials, the government, it's felt that the Feldpost wasn't safe enough for really important communication. And so they in 1942, they actually created a post office in Oslo for German official mail, Deutsches Dienstpostamt. And this mail is stamped with I'll have an example right there with German stamps. Even though they're mailed from Norway, they're using German stamps. This is the cover I'm passing around. So this was sent from the Dienstpostamt in Oslo. It was right downtown Oslo, not too far from the bar you and Steve went to. And it went to, I can't tell where that went to, can't interpret it, but it went to Germany, obviously. And it was also used by officers for personal mail. So you could use that channel for personal mail if you were a, German officer stationed in Norway. Then we had the Red Cross mail, which was a mail service that many of you probably know about. I did not know about it until I started researching this project. But they operated a system for communication across front lines that went through the HQ of, or the headquarters of Red Cross in Geneva in Switzerland. And essentially they're open mail. So you could send a message, which is limited to 25 words. Can't say anything bad about Germany. Can't talk about politics. Just say, hey, we're okay, all well. And in this particular case, this is one that's sent from Trondheim, Norway, and it goes to Alberta, Canada. And it just says, "Dear Tomini, you are in my thoughts. Missing you and looking forward to seeing you. Take care of yourself, but wish the world was better. Kisses and hugs from Carl, Ruth, and the kids." And then it goes to Alberta, and Tomini, or whatever the name is replying. It was sent October 6th. It's returned January 20th. And again, has to pass through Geneva, Switzerland. Bob was telling me that his parents were interred in Utah, and their Red Cross mail between two locations in the US even had to go.
No,
No,
in the US it was not censored.
it wasn't.
My mom's parents were in Japan.
So that had to go through Switzerland.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. I thought mail sent via Red Cross mail in the US had to go to Switzerland as well. So, but of course not. But yeah, internationally it was. Over time, we start to get a pretty active resistance movement, which I will talk about shortly. And the people who worked here, they would establish secret mail routes for courier mail between Norway and Sweden. Again, Sweden is neutral, so if you can make it to the Swedish border, you're safe. There's strong chances of getting caught along the way, but as long as you make it to here, there's a big swath of forest that's cut, so they knew they were at the border. And that line, basically, this is Oslo. This was the, we call it the Flyktingruten. It was called the Refugee Trail is what that means, Flyktingruten. And my nephew told me today that's a marathon you can run. They are on the same trails. It's more than a marathon, but I think it goes about halfway and back. But anyway, here's the Swedish border. And so if you could make it there, you were safe. So brave people would transport, mail that couldn't go through the postal service for obvious reasons, because it was meant to try to, plan sabotage actions against the Germans. So this mail had to make it to London. Somebody in London would, fly and drop soldiers back into Norway to execute this operation. The heavy water operation in the Rjukan, where the Germans were trying to build a nuclear bomb, is a great example. You couldn't send, communication about that through the mail. And that's where the courier service came into play. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the resistance movement, because the resistance movement and the role of the neutral Sweden and the role of Great Britain was a key part of how Norway and the West ended up winning the war. So the resistance movement consisted of several entities. Milorg was a citizen organized resistance movement in Norway. It was citizen-led, it was underground, They had more than 40,000 members by the end of the war. Then remember, we have the Norwegian government in London. Our king is in London. And so working with Great Britain and the Special Operations Executive, the SOE military unit in England, we developed a military unit under SOE that we call Norway 1. Popularly, it was called Compagnie Linge because Captain Linge was the one leading it, though he was killed in line of duty. But there were a total of 297 active duty military, out of which 57 died during the war. So a pretty small unit, considering how many troops, German troops there were in Norway. They estimate there were about 40,000 Germans in Norway during World War II. And then we have the Oslo gang, which was yet a subsidiary under Norway 1, and that was the operation, the unit that operated in Oslo, where some of the biggest sabotage acts took place. And I'm focusing in on them because A, it's an interesting story, and B, I knew one of them. And so I'm just sort of personalizing this a little bit. But there's also a great movie made about them called Max Manus, which is also, I believe, on Netflix. Max Manus was one of the members of that unit. So before we go there, Sweden's neutrality. How does neutrality work? Just say, hey, I'm neutral, so you can't invade me, right? That's, I mean, since the Napoleonic War of 1812, Sweden had been neutral. They remained neutral until 2008. Now they're part of NATO. You can't be part of NATO and claim neutrality. But, for almost 2 centuries, Sweden remained neutral. Now, you could still invade a neutral country, but Hitler did not, because he had more to gain from cooperation from Sweden. He wanted their iron ore. That was very valuable in the production of weapons. But what that meant for Norway, having a neutral neighbor right next door, was that it was a safe place to go. So anytime things got too hot, you could go and hide in Sweden. You could actually fly out of Sweden to London, and that was the escape route for these people in the resistance movement. But it was also the channel through which we sent communication. So these people in the resistance movement, they were ordinary Norwegian citizens. Few of them had any military training, so they went to London, to England, to Scotland, and received special training under SOE, Special Operations Executive. They went out via Sweden, and typically they were returned to Norway in parachutes. They flew in over the big mountain ranges in middle Norway and dropped them in parachutes. And the case study that I want to share with you is Gunnar Sønsteby, because I knew him personally. He was my parents' neighbor, and spoke to him many, many times. He was born in 1918, and he got involved in the resistance movement in 1940. He was a student in Oslo when Germany invaded in April. And he decided, you know what, I'm going to join the resistance movement. And he got trained in the UK. And he was involved in several of the key operations that sabotaged German operations during World War II. After World War II, he went to the United States, got a degree at Harvard, and was a successful businessman in Norway. He, when I knew him, he was constantly touring, U.S. in particular, giving talks about his life and World War II. He's an amazing man. He died in 2012 at the age of 94. So here are just some examples of the kind of resistance, the things the resistance movement did, and some of the things that he personally was involved in. One of my favorite stories was that they needed more cash. The Norwegian exile government in London, they were strapped for cash. They didn't have much. They had their gold reserve that they had taken with them, some of it. And they had the merchant marine who was out on the oceans. That was basically, those were our resources. And there was only so much you could beg, borrow, and steal from Great Britain and the United States. And so in 1942, they decided, what if we steal the printing plates for printing money? And we can print our own money. And Gunnar Sønsteby broke into the Bank of Norway in Oslo, got the printing plates. On his way to Sweden, taking a taxi, the taxi goes off the road on the ice and it ends up in the ditch. And some nice German soldiers pulls them back out and wishes them well on the way. He said that was one of the most nerve-wracking minutes in his life. He makes it successfully to Sweden. They make imprints of the printing plates, sends them back to Norway, places them back at the bank, and meanwhile the imprints goes to London and they print more money. They bombed the labor office in Oslo. The reason why they bombed the labor office, that was much later, was because towards the end of the war, Germany was getting desperate and they were trying to recruit Norwegians to join the German military. And the labor office had all the records on eligible soldiers. And so they numerous different actions. Again, if you want to learn more about this, the movie Max Mann is recommended. Gunnar Sønsteby has also written several books that have been translated into English. And so they were active all the way up until March of 45, and then May of 1945, just 6 days before Germany surrenders. They start securing the police and the justice archives because they were afraid that Germany was going to blow them up to destroy evidence. So they started preparing to secure Norway for a return to normalcy right before the end of the war. So a lot of different things they were involved in. One of my favorite stories from his book is about the encrypted letters that he would send. So even though you use courier service, if one of those couriers got caught with a letter, you don't want the Germans to be able to read the content. So they used encrypted letters. And being before the age of computing, we didn't have, obviously, computer encrypting. And this is impossible to read from there. I wish I could use the zoom. I don't know why it doesn't work. You know what? Here, let's stop this really quick. And let me get back into it and see if I can zoom. There we go. Okay, so what's going on here is that you see words in Norwegian. So here it says, we have decided to, and then it's followed by a sequence of numbers. Here's how the encryption worked. Gunnar Sønsteby in Sweden would have a, receiver in Norway, or rather the other way around. He would be in Oslo sending this letter to Sweden. They would both agree to use a book, let's say Henrik Ibsen's Peer Gynt, 3rd edition. And let's use page 23. That's our encryption key. So if my code is 14.6, it means you go down 14 rows, 6 letters out. And so 14.6 represents the letter E because 14 rows down, 6 letters out is the letter E. That's how they did the encryption. So you can imagine it took a while. And this has actually been, translated. So for example, this code right here says values, verdier. That long sequence of numbers says values. And so that's how they did their encryption of their secret mail. Meanwhile, the post office in Norway works reasonably well. During World War II, they had strong financial results, about 20% profit margin each year. There was a lack of infrastructure because the Germans were exhausting all the resources for the war. So there was little renewal and development during the war, and sick leave increased dramatically. People probably weren't sick, but they just didn't want to cooperate and work. But yet certain portions of the postal service in Norway did really well, and there was even some innovation. So parcel post, for example, increased by 300%, revenue increase of 300% from 1940 to 1945. Can you guess why? Why do you think people were sending so many more parcels?
Clothing?
Clothing could have been, but there was an even bigger reason. A shortage more urgent than clothing, food. So a lot of food was sent by mail during World War II. And there was a story of apparently a notice to customers to please refrain from sending fish through the postal system because people were wrapping fish, in paper and mailing it. Can you imagine those those covers, what they look like? On the subject of innovation, Postgiro was actually introduced in 1943. Now, Postgiro still existed when I was a kid, and it was an early way of sending money electronically, in a sense. Norwegians have always been kind of early adopters. When I was growing up, everything we did in America, they would copy. But in the case of money, they've always been a little bit ahead of us. You go to Norway today and you're not going to find many people alive who have seen a check. That they don't use checks anymore. It's all electronic. But this started in 1943 with Postgiro. And so Postgiro essentially worked in the following way. You would open a bank account at the post office. So as a kid, I had a post office bank account where I put my allowance every week. And if I send money to Steve, Steve would have a post office bank account. I would fill out one of these Postgiro, as we call them. I would put Steve's name, his address, and the amount of money that I'm sending to you. And they would know which account to debit and which account to credit. And I would put that in the mail, and 2 days later, that money shows up in Steve's account. That was Postgiro, and that was actually, I did not know that, but it was invented during World War II. And Norway was not the first country. I believe France had it earlier. But again, just an innovation that could happen during a time of crisis. It's kind of interesting to me. Yes.
How do they have fraud with that? If someone has the account number, and how do they verify that? the
I-
sender is-
Well, I believe, it's kind of like a money letter. Well, back in the day when you send money letters, you would put money in an envelope and write on the outside how much money was in the envelope. And once it entered the postal system, it was considered secure.
I used to send those like back in the 80s and 90s, and I had subscriptions to various state agencies, and just go to the post office and ask for an international letter.
Yep. In fact, we have a building in Oslo called the Postgirobygget, and that was built specifically for handling the huge volume of Postgiro. Of course, Postgiro died in the 1990s with banks taking over electronic payments. But at one point, we had an entire building full of people who processed these Postgiros. So it created a lot of jobs. Talk a little bit about Norwegian stamps during World War II. So there were a lot of stamp issues during the war years. Any stamps with the images of the royal family were confiscated, which is why you'll find way more mint stamps of the royal family from that era than you will find them used. 1941, we saw the most Norwegian stamps issued in a single year if you count by catalog number, and that's the Norwegian catalog. And the reason for that, we'll get back to that in a second. Also, a record number of semi-postal stamps. You can imagine the Nazi Party was trying to raise money, and so semi-postal stamps could be used for that cause. And the 1943 London issue, we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk a little bit about Nazi symbolism on Norwegian stamps. So first of all, examples of Crown Prince or our Princess of Norway, the wife of King Haakon. These stamps were all confiscated. These were issued in 1938. All confiscated, but again, I think mint copies of these are probably worth a tenth of actual canceled stamps. There's a lot of known counterfeits with these. 1941, we have 58 catalog numbers in Norway. Part of that is because you have the definitive Post-Horn Lion series with and without watermark and with and without the V mark. The V mark, by the way, was not Norway copying Churchill and saying victory. It was actually Hitler saying, I want my own V. Why should Churchill be the only one who gets to have a victory? And so this was Nazi symbolism. It was not a freedom kind of thing. The one stamp here that's quite valuable is the NK 272. This one with a watermark is one of the more valuable current day Norwegian stamps, $150 to $200. You know, most Norwegian stamps are not that valuable. Sorry, this one. Ooh. That's Enco 272. Many semi-postal issues. You know, this was the most despised Norwegian of all time, Vidkun Quisling, our Nazi prime minister. These again are very common in mint. This particular stamp was issued only in 100,000 copies, and is considered, you know, bit of a collector's item. They're not terribly expensive, $30 to $40 now these days. But it was very much a philatelic release. Most of those were used on first day covers or bought by collectors, and very rare to see used postally. Like I mentioned earlier, the Oslo Philately Club ran a stamp exchange program with the Germans' permission. They were basically saying, like, we will guarantee that there's no propaganda on these. We were just exchanging stamps, and please don't censor these. So here's 1 cent, you know, to Zurich, Switzerland. The London issue. So the London issue was actually issued in 1943 for use on merchant ships. And so merchant ships were not considered occupied. And so you were allowed to operate with Norwegian stamps. And these are the only modern day Norwegian issues that have not been printed in Norway. There's a series that got overprints on May 17th, 1943, our national holiday. And there's 4,000 of these sets made. And these sets typically sell for, you know, $300 to $400, these overprints. The regular issue is very, very common. And they were officially released for normal use in Norway on April 30th, 1945. And then they added these two values as well, which was not in the original series. But again, merchant marines, you can see here examples. They were allowed to use these stamps on the ships. There were a lot of official stamps, and these are probably the ones that have the most Nazi symbolism of all. The sun cross, the sundial, which was the symbol for the Norwegian National Samling, the Norwegian Nazi Party, with the eagle on top. And it was not uncommon in Norway to put them on upside down. The eagle has surrendered. You know, the eagle is on its back. That was sort of, you know, Norwegians would frequently find ways to taunt the Nazis. They were very easily offended, and this was just one little way of taunting them. We had a lot of slogan cancels. I may have sent that out. There was a slogan cancel app on this one here. You know, this one says, you know, svarte handlere er samfunnsfiender. So black market dealers are enemies of the people. That's the slogan. Because during World War II, there was so much food shortage that people had no choice but to try to scavenge food from other sources. And so the Germans were trying to shut that down. But again, even this one was occasionally put upside down. I haven't found the cover, but if you flip it upside down, this says, afraid not. So screw you, I'm afraid not. And so there was a lot of those kinds of things going on. Just kind of do a little dig on the Germans. This slogan cancel, again, it's got the sun cross with the eagle. It says, towards brighter times. Now, that was the Germans saying, you know, brighter times ahead. Yeah, well, brighter times ahead for us, not for you. Just to wrap up with some personal stories. My parents, like I said, were teens during World War II. This is my mom. She's about, you know, born in 1927. My dad, born in 1925. You know, life went on as normal for the most part. My dad had ration cards. He saved them. We have a whole book full of his memorabilia from World War II. So this was a bread and flour ration card. Both of these are bread and flour. This one I think is interesting. This is Postal stationery. and it's a equipment requisition card. So they had pre-printed postal stationery with a 5 plus 10 öre postal stationery. And on the back, you can see that it says, you know, my dad's name. He would have been 16 years old in 1943. Let me discard my, so I can zoom in here. So it says, Life Brande, born, 1925. He was applying to work in the herring industry. His hometown of Havgesund was herring is like the one of the main industries, and he's applying here for a pair of jeans so that he can do work in the herring field. So he had to request a pair of jeans, and he had to use a postal stationery to request that. So kind of an interesting little personal item to have. My sister's father-in-law, Per Wolle, was one of the first and only pilots to shoot down a German bomber on April 9th. Germany did meet a little bit of resistance, and I did not realize that Per, who I knew very well as a child, was a bomber pilot. He later on went to Little Norway in Toronto, Canada, as a trainer, and he was involved in a crash in Canada that left him badly injured. He was even shot down on a mission over Germany in 1943 and was in the German POW camp. Apparently he was treated well, and he was released in 1945. An amazing man. By the way, this is the Wings for Norway stamp, which was issued to commemorate Little Norway. And this was originally supposed to be issued in 1944, but it ran into a lot of bureaucracy and disagreements, and so it was not issued until 1946. Here's a cover from Little Norway, Canada. I brought that with me. This is Per in recent years. He passed away a few years ago at the age of 95, but he's meeting with Jens Stoltenberg, who many of you recognize as the recently retired NATO chief. And Jens Stoltenberg was also our prime minister. This is when he was prime minister, and Per got honored. My grandfather, unbeknownst to me, ran the Red Cross in Norway during World War II. I didn't realize that until I came across his obituary. My dad never mentioned this to me. By the way, I forgot to put in a picture of him from Chicago, but he actually went to Northwestern here in Chicago. Now imagine this. He gets widowed at 1929 when his wife dies of apoplectic shock. My dad's 2 years old. He leaves his family in Norway, who's just lost their mom, and moves to Chicago to get another degree in dentistry. He left them at home with a housekeeper, and my dad says never affected him, but I can't see how a 3-year-old all of a sudden with both parents gone, wouldn't be affected. But anyway, my grandfather, again, he ran the Red Cross in Norway during World War II. This is my mom's cousin, Kjell Hansen, who was another part of the resistance movement. And he sadly was captured and killed by the Germans just weeks before the end of World War II. He was in an operation where they were trying to blow up an office, and he was chased by the Germans, and he didn't manage to clear a wall, and they shot him on the spot. Steve.
Yeah, that wasn't a question, but
Yeah, we're out of time.
yeah, there's people, I hear people.
Yep.
There's another presentation.
Yep. So anyway, we'll wrap up. After World War II, we get back to Norwegian control of mail. These are pretty common. These are going on through 1946 before we end up censoring. There's another collection area is prisoner of war mail. Got lots of those. Independent Brigade in Germany. My dad's stationed there, sending letters to Norway from Germany with Norwegian postmarks. This is visiting with Gunnar Sønsteby, the man I told you the story about in 2007. My wife, he signed his latest book for us at that time. They made a film about him. That's him on the left and the actor paying him on the right. And commemorative stamp they issued about him in 2018. So with that, I'll happy to give you this list of my sources. We'll wrap up. Appreciate everyone's time.